So, I am obsessed. And it's not uncommon that this happens, but in the last year or two, I have been wanting to buy old consoles because I just think they're fun. And turns out I was extremely correct because oh boy, are they fun. So sitting next to you right now is a original model PlayStation 1, the chunky boy, with the flip top lid that looks like a children's food tray, and I absolutely love it. Unfortunately, the one game I really wanted to play on it didn't come out in the PAL regions because of some reason or another. So I've been playing that on emulator instead, but it is Xenogears. And for those of you who've not played Xenogears, it is what Final Fantasy VII was originally pitched as, which is very, very cool because, oh boy, if they released this as Final Fantasy VII, very different timeline we would be in. Very, very different timeline. Um, for context, the game is very full on and it doesn't hold back on very confronting concepts. And it's very, very good at what it does, which is incredible given that it was made in 1997, I believe. So, for those of you who don't know what the Xeno series is, it still continues to this day. Obviously, we've got Xenogears, which was a single one-off game that was originally intended to be about 6 games. They wanted to do a full saga about it, which is interesting because then they named their next series Xenosaga. And it's hard to describe. It's a very traditional combat style JRPG, but one that also tries to say a lot in the way that it's written. And it's one of the few games from that period that I think actually achieves a lot in that regard. In that it's not just good for a video game, it's actually just good for narrative. So it's hard to say though, because the game is not approachable, and that's the risk. Because the story is, it starts off with a text scroll where you are reading for about 5 minutes, and that's not very common, especially not in the day. That was not common. So it kind of pushes you away unless you are actively trying to enjoy it, and it led to a really interesting discussion that I think Matt's probably better tasked to talk about, simply because he plays a lot more of these sorts of games. So Matt, what is your thoughts on games that sort of push you away but are, actually saying something?
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's a very dense game. It's quite nihilistic in its tone, given that I mean, most other things, I mean, it was a controversial game because part of it was you killed God. It's okay to do spoilers for games that are like 50 years old at this point.
Oh,
So
it tells you killed God in the first 5 minutes.
yeah, so that's kind of why I imagine it didn't get through as the Final Fantasy VII. I mean, not that Final Fantasy VII is without its own point to make, because it definitely does. It's kind of, as everybody knows, it's all about ecoterrorism and all that kind of stuff. But Final Xenogears is of a different level entirely. We were joking about it in the Slack in organizing this podcast, and we're talking about how the best kind of narrative comparison to it's probably Pathologic, because it's just it is that very dense and challenging game that really asks a lot of its players in terms of analysis and interpretation of the plot and stuff, which is good. It'd be nice if there were more games that were like that, out
Yeah,
and about. But yeah,
it's
I guess that's the thing. We don't get that many of them. I mean, even the Xeno series, Xenosaga had plenty to say, but the Xenoblade Chronicles series, while being very good games, are certainly not as intense in the narrative as the earlier ones.
they're more approachable.
Yeah, they've been made much more approachable. Which is not to say they don't have anything to say. They do, and they're not unintelligent games by any means, but they're just back then, those kinds of really intense games that had a lot to say, and would be quite easy to. It's quite easy for a player not to get along with those games, because if you're not willing to kind of follow along with it on its own narrative merits, then you're going to miss out on a lot of it. If you're not able to apply a lot of theory to it and stuff, there's just stuff you're going to miss as you play through that game. Which is not to say you can't, but it does mean that it's like a Shakespeare of games, I guess, in a sense. that
It's
there's a lot
so
of
much.
there's a lot of interpretation involved, and that was the case with a lot of PlayStation games. If you ever get a chance, Alan, you should try and give the original Persona a go. I don't know if you played the later Personas, but I know you've played 5.
I've played
But
4, 3, and 5. Yeah,
okay, there you go.
I was
So
gonna try and do Revelations at some point.
Persona 1 and 2 are very different games, and again, the change has been quite significant. But those earlier games had a much darker point to make and were much less accommodating about it than the later games. Which is again not to say that the Persona 3, 4, and 5 don't have anything to say themselves, but Persona 1 and 2 were certainly more intense about it.
It's fair. I mean, one of the things that really grabbed my eye right away with playing Xenogears was the main character actively saying, "No, I don't want to deal with this. I've got enough on my plate right now," and clearly just showing signs of like manic depression, but like it not being said that that was what was happening. It's really well done, which is bizarre again, given that it's like little sprite guys running around. Um, and the writing, the translation, I believe it was the same guy who did the translation for Chrono Cross, which is a phenomenal translation in its own right. But I don't know how the heck he did this, because the amount of like references to like biblical entities and like philosophy and psychological um you know like mental disorders and stuff like that. It's insane. Like, how do you know this stuff? How do you translate that? And then also having the balls to write that sort of stuff in the 90s is just beyond me. I think it's fantastic. And I think it comes back down to this idea that there was a bit more of a charm. And I think playing things on an old console that it doesn't have this whole thing of like you connect it to the internet in order to play it. You log into your account in order to play it. No, you just do stuff. You put the thing in and it works. And I really, really appreciate that. It's something that I wasn't expecting to appreciate as much as I do.
I
I mean,
do
because
wonder if
I
I do wonder if, to an extent, with more modern consoles, developers are kind of forced to be more aware of whether their stuff can be taken out of context, I guess, and that kind of affects how they go about writing their stories and stuff like that. Because you can just screenshot a single frame or do a quick clip of a minute of a game, and then that taken out of context could get controversial. It could start to People could start to criticize it without having the full context of it, and that certainly applies to any game that has a particularly serious point to make. Like if you were to take certain individual sections of Xenogears and put them up on the internet or whatever, then a lot of people will be like, "Well, what are you doing? This is very problematic. How dare you?" Kind of thing. And we've seen that a little bit with some other games too. Like there are even the likes of Persona 4 and 5 have sections or little bits, individual lines of dialogue or whatever, that get taken out of context, and people were like, well, this represents a problematic game, when in context it doesn't really. So I just wonder if that actually does affect how developers think about it. I know developers think about the potential for their games to get turned into memes for the positive side of things, that you get some viral hit from something weird and quirky happening in Yakuza 0 or whatever. And so developers actually do try and get some of that into their games just so it gets spread around. But I wonder if there is that concern that their game might be taken out of context at places, which earlier developers probably didn't have, because the only way that you could experience that game is to actually play it.
Yeah.
If that makes sense, because the only media available was the stuff that the developers took themselves as promotional, PR material, whatever, and that was what got published in magazines and reviews back in those days. And then the critic had to sit down and actually play through the whole thing, where you could get context. Because I guess the point I'm making here is that I don't think Xenogears could be made today, because it would get slammed, it gets slaughtered.
Yeah, probably.
Not
People would go
because
in
of
expecting like a happy, joyful,
no, not
you
just
know,
that. Not just that. It's just people would go in expecting I mean, people would find individual bits and pieces of it to take offense at, and then all of a sudden the entire game gets kind of slammed. We saw it to a certain extent with Final Fantasy 16 this year, that every kind of key theme that it tried to bring up, people would either deliberately or just because they're too ignorant to to understand or to interpret, misinterpret it. Like the whole slave thing. How many times did we see people criticizing Final Fantasy 16 for the main character Clive taking so long supposedly to learn that slavery was bad, when it was pretty obvious that the whole time his whole family was opposed to slavery. That was kind of the point. People missed it because of an individual line of dialogue here or there that was taken out of context. So yeah, I don't think Xenogears could happen in 2023.
I can fully imagine as well that the game would be called like against some sort of religion, given the names that they use for all the things. Like the fact it's all like I think it's Old Testament names, like most of it, which is hugely appropriate because of course it is. And then also the fact that two of the characters are cousins and getting married as well, which was a bit surprising to me initially when I first played it as well. I was like, oh, okay, it's one of those things, but it makes sense because it's like an old, it's how it was done back in the day
set
in the old
Alabama.
Europe town. Yeah, it's set in Alabama.
Well, I think the other thing is, that kind of scene you wouldn't be able to do that scene in 2024 because firstly sensitivities and people would flip out about it. But I think because Xenogears also looks quite old, I think people distance themselves a little bit more from it, if that makes sense. And you're able to see it in a more literary way. It's like you're reading a book in a sense that you can interpret it a bit better. It's the same, if you were to, in literature, a book like, extreme example, I guess, a book like Lolita exists. But if you were to do that in a video game, then the interactivity, even if you're making the same point, the interactivity of it would flip people big time. So yeah, I think the older games definitely have that literary quality to them because they look primitive.
I think there's just a charm to it as well. I mean, so I was going to say that I grew up with a PS1 at my grandparents' house. So I would go there and I would play Time Crisis 1 with the gun con. I'd play Oddworld, Abe's Odyssey, and I'd play Crash Bandicoot 1. And having that same like feeling of like turning this on and having the same sounds happen is just phenomenal. So I don't know. Have you guys gone back and bought anything that you played as a child?
I mean, I've got an analog pocket that I picked up just a couple of weeks ago.
Right, you got one?
Yes, I did manage to get one. I didn't get one from Analog. I just knew a guy that wanted to sell his, so I took the chance to buy it. So secondhand, but it wasn't. He never used it, so it's effectively new. Anyway, yes, I finally got an Analog Pocket. And while Nintendo didn't make that, if I was Nintendo, I'd actually be in discussions to acquire this company to produce all the hardware because they make the most pristine, high quality hardware I've ever experienced. This thing is an incredible handheld console, and as a result of that, I've been able to go back and play all the Game Boy and Game Boy Advance games that I've been picking up from my trips to Japan and whatever in a format that's actually comfortable. I can actually see it, which is nice. Couldn't do that with the old Game Boy. Yeah, with the old Game Boy Color, I can't actually see the screen very clearly because it's it wasn't backlit, and I'm just too old for that shit now. So yeah, having the Analog Pocket has been great. I've got about 70 Game Boy games, I think, and another 20 Game Boy Advance games, and I've kind of been playing those and rediscovering the classics that way.
It just feels better.
It does, and I mean, it's nice. It's nice to actually
hardware.
play. It's nice to actually play the thing that you legally own and stuff. I mean, as everybody knows, I've got no problem with emulation consoles as well, but there is a difference in experience when you're playing the official and physical product that you actually purchased and legally own. So yeah, the experience is different. I definitely love my Analog Pocket.
It's okay. There's a perfectly legitimate emulation console. It's called the PlayStation 1 Classic. All you need to do is plug a USB into it, and then you can do whatever you want with it.
I was thinking about that, but I don't like how it looks. It
The
just
con
makes me not feel happy.
the console as like it's just weird and tiny and chunky. It's
I don't like it being that tiny. Nothing should be that small. Brad, have you bought anything that's sort of like from your childhood that you're like, oh hell yeah.
Well, I still have my original Game Boy from when I got it from in Christmas when I was in year four. Um,
Oh, that's amazing.
it still has like my mum's driver's license number engraved into it because she had used to have this obsession about engraving her driver's license number in anything valuable we had in our house so that people wouldn't steal it and pawn it off. But yeah, just turning that on, like even like it's really cool taking it into like my classrooms and stuff and showing the kids like this is what I used to play on, and they're like, this is janky old crap. Why are you bringing this here? But like, um, it is really cool. Like just having like what Matt said, like not having a backlit light and going, well, I need to play this Game Boy game. Where's the closest open window? And like having the authentic experience is really cool. But like,
Is
I've
there a
also
single worse thing in the world than being on a car trip trying to play original Game Boy or Game Boy Advance and having to hold it up under the like street lights to try and see the
No,
screen?
Alan, did you not have the accessories?
No, I didn't have any of
no, I
those. I
didn't
was
know.
told that I should just stop playing if it's getting too dark.
Yeah,
No, you
yeah,
gotta have the
it'll hurt your
lights
eyes.
and the magnifying glass and what else? What else? There was a magnifying glass, a light, and then there was something else. It you could have like a whole robot coming off the console with how much crap was available.
The only accessory I had was just the AC adapter, so I didn't have to keep buying batteries
Oh,
for it.
so good. That was phenomenal. Honestly, it saved me so much effort. The only issue is I didn't use my Game Boy Advance out of the house except for like there. Um, and because of that, I broke the GBA battery pack clippy thing by
Yeah.
accident. So now I couldn't keep my batteries in, so I had to use tape to stick it on. It's just how it was.
The other things I've bought, like I bought a Super Nintendo and a Nintendo 64, but I feel like trying to play those on an LCD television, it just comes out really gross and horrible. So I think I need to try and invest and try and see if I can find an old CRT television somewhere so I can just get that authentic feel.
The
Yeah, I mean they're
authentic
not.
radiation.
Yeah.
Hell yeah. They radioactive. What?
I don't know. Like everything gives you cancer these days.
Oh, I thought you were being genuinely like serious there. I was like, what?
I mean, if you
Is it
pull it
actually
apart, it
alive?
probably gives you cancer, but I don't know. Like,
I
there
do not want to find
there
out. I'm
there
not
is
willing to find out.
there is that problem with those kind of old consoles for TV, that yeah, for me, I do have a Super Nintendo as well, but to be honest, I just use the Super NES app on the N64, I think, because it's the emulation is designed to better replicate the experience, I guess, of actually playing those games.
Yeah.
And then for the games that aren't on the Super NES app, I have the high Cs and my emulation consoles because they do the same thing when you hook them up to the TV via HDMI. So yeah, that for me is an issue with older consoles with modern TVs. Funnily enough,
Yeah.
I mean, from probably the PlayStation. Not that I've tried to plug a PlayStation into a flat screen TV, but I would imagine that's probably not such a issue.
It's honestly fine. I've not had any issues. I've got a HDMI converter for mine currently, and it gets the job done. Like it looks as it does on other things. So yeah, I mean it's totally doable. Also, a PS1 is actually not too expensive at the moment. It's like it's actually fairly affordable to get one and get a couple of games. Some of them are extremely expensive, which is ridiculous. Like trying to get a copy of Resident Evil 1, 2, or 3 is gonna set you back at like, you know, $50 each, basically, up here. Which is mental. But yeah, it's a different experience. Like I get a lot of joy and having people over and playing Tekken 3 with them as opposed to playing like a new Tekken is just There's something more like about it, a bit more raw, a bit more exciting. I just like it a lot.
I tell you what, every time I play those older games, I'm just reminded of how ridiculously bloated games are these days. Like with the number of modes and the different ways to play
Oh
them
God,
and whatever. Like
just make a good game that's fun to play. Stop putting in
yeah,
shit.
because I've been playing. I mean, I have actually been playing a little bit of Tekken as well because one of the Tekkens got released on the PlayStation.
T6.
Yeah, so I've been playing a little bit of that, and it is nice to have the relatively thin roster and the relatively few number of ways to play and stuff, as opposed to these modern fighting games which just drown you in content like everything else. Or a Game Boy game is only, you can run through most of them in an hour if that. Once you get used to them, versus the massively long commitment that you're going to put into every game that gets released these days. So even the RPGs on the GBA, for example, they're over in 20, 30 hours.
20 hours max.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas you play Persona 5, it's 130. You play Baldur's Gate, it's 150 or whatever. These are that 100-hour threshold is just getting broken with such regularity with video games these days. And then you play these older ones and you're just like, do you really need them to be that long? Not really.
This is getting the job done.
Xenogears itself is not that long.
No, because it's only about 15 hours a game, and then they ran out of money halfway through, and then had to make it into a text adventure.
Yes. So
that's one of my favorite stories.
So yeah,
so literally, because it was a new dev team. For those who don't know, it was a new dev team that were brought together to work on Xenogears, and they got about a year and a half through, realized they had no money, and they were like, "Shit, we have to finish this. How are we going to finish this?" And originally, Square wanted to ship the first disc as its own game, and then let them do a sequel if it sold well. But they were like, "No, let's not do that because it doesn't make any sense because all the plot threads that we have are not resolved at all." So what they did for disc 2 is they just had the main characters recounting events as they happened while sitting in a chair. And you occasionally got to play a game. It's really, really bizarre. I've never seen anything like it. I love it. It's unlike anything that I've ever seen in a game where they've just been like, I don't know, now it's a book. Big respect to that.